A new day dawns. The apostle en route to Corinth. It was the year 52 or 53 AD, according to one accepted chronology. The apostle was in Antioch of Syria, where he had returned following the council at Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, 30 through 35. He decided to make a second missionary journey to visit the brethren in every city where he and Barnabas earlier had preached the word. He chose Silas to accompany him on his second journey in Acts 15, 36 through 40. Silas was a prophet in Acts 15 and 32. One of those, along with Judas Barsabas, the apostle, who was chosen in the 12 in Acts chapter 1 by the apostles and elders to return with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch to help confirm the council's action. Silas had decided to remain in Antioch while Judas returned to Jerusalem in Acts 15, 22 through 34. Timothy joined Paul and Silas at Lystra in the province of Galatia in modern-day Turkey. Acts 15, 41 through Acts 18 and 1 gives us the record of their journey from Antioch to Corinth, which may have taken more than a year. Incidentally, since the book of the Acts of the Apostles contains the historical record of the establishment of the church at Corinth, it must be noted that Luke, the author, attended Paul on his missionary journeys. Eusebius, the church historian, says that Luke was a native of Antioch, that he was a physician by profession, and that he was a companion of Paul. In his epistles, Paul refers to him several times. For instance, quote, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you, Colossians 4 and 14. Quote, there salute thee Epaphras, Lucas, Luke, and my fellow laborers, Philemon 23 and 24. And, quote, only Luke is with me, 2 Timothy 4 and 11, end of quote. At Troas, or Troy, a city on the northwest extremity of the province of Asia, in Asia Minor, or western Turkey today, Paul had his great vision and call. Come over into Macedonia and help us. Acts 16, 9 and 10. This was the beginning of his gospel ministry on the continent of Europe. It appears that the churches were established at Philippi, Thessaloniki, or Thessalonica, and Berea. The Jews at Berea stirred up the people in Acts 17 and 13, and evidently for his protection, the Berean brethren sent Paul away. Quote, and they conducted Paul and brought him unto Athens in Acts 17, 14 and 15. Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Paul waited for them at Athens. While he waited, his spirit was stirred within him to preach the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers on Mars Hill. He took his text from the inscription on the altar to the unknown God. Some believed and some mocked and others procrastinated. So Paul departed from among them in Acts 17, 15 through 34. Some expositors and commentators chalk this up as a failure for Paul. On what grounds, it is difficult to see. It seems clear that that Athens was not the only place he preached without establishing a church. Jesus plainly indicated not every city would receive the gospel. Matthew chapter 10, 11 through 23, and Luke 10, 1 through 16 declare that. The commission is to go and to preach the gospel. The hearers are free to receive or to reject it, as Mark 16, 15, and 16 tells us. Paul delivered his soul at Athens, just as he had done elsewhere. Then he simply moved on into the next towns, just as Jesus had done in Mark 1 and 38. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Acts 18 and 1. The Corinthian church at the Church of God at Corinth, Acts 18, 1 through 18, is the scriptural record of the establishment of the church at Corinth. The Jews had a wise custom of teaching their children some trade by which to make a living. Even though they might otherwise be fortunate enough to have economic and educational advantages, Paul's trade was tent making. At the time he came to Corinth, he had already been in the gospel ministry perhaps up to 18 years. He had made it his policy to preach the gospel without charge. We find this in 1 Corinthians 9 and 18, also 1 Corinthians 4, 11 and 12, and 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 12, and 2 Corinthians 12, 13 through 16. Therefore, it is possible that when he had arrived at Corinth, his first need was to find employment by which to sustain himself while he sought every opportunity to minister. Another of his policies had been to go first among his own ethnic people, the Jews, to the synagogue, to visit the synagogue. This gave him openings to preach Christ to them. Long ago, he had learned that most of them would reject the gospel, but he would give them every opportunity. As a rule, some would believe, and the apostle would have a nucleus for a church. In this case, Paul's trade opened the way for the Christian witness. Almost immediately, he found a certain Jew named Aquila and his wife Priscilla, Acts 18 and 1. It is conjectured by some that Aquila and Priscilla may have already been believers, since Aquila was from Pontus, there in Turkey, and they had earlier arrived from Rome, Acts 18 and 2. On the day of Pentecost, there were Jews present from both of these areas in Acts chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And some who had become believers on this occasion are thought to have returned to their homes as witnesses to others. At any rate, Aquila and Priscilla became Christian laborers with Paul and followed him to Ephesus in Acts chapter 18, 18 and 26. At length they returned to Rome in Romans 16 and 3. And still later, they were in the church at Ephesus in 1 Timothy 1 and 3, where Paul sent greetings to them in his second letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4 and 19. Again, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks in Acts 18 and 4. Verse 5 had provoked some supposition, but the arrival of Silas and Timothy evidently was a great encouragement to Paul. The three could doubtless be more effective than Paul alone in providing material means as well as being more convincing testimony. At any rate, Paul was now able to give a full time to the promotion of the gospel. The conversion of Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, with all of his house, was a decided breakthrough. Paul, having separated himself from the synagogue, seems to have signaled the Gentile Christians to believe and be baptized. Then the vision from the Lord gave assurance that a great work had only just begun. God had much people, even in that city, of moral and spiritual depravity, called by one commentator a hotbed of vice. So he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But it was not an easy road. The Jews made a concerted, organized effort to have Paul legally prosecuted. But God gave him favor in Deputy Galileo's eyes, and he was dismissed of the accusations without so much as of a hearing. It appears that Sosthenes was Crispus' successor as a chief ruler of the synagogue, since the Jews had incited the insurrection. The Greeks turned to Sosthenes as leader, and Gallio made it no concern of his own. Paul stayed on at Corinth for some time and was privileged to leave with all things in comparative peace and quietness. It must be assumed that Paul established a church at Corinth, possibly soon after Silas and Timothy joined him there. At any rate, some 6 or 7 years later, about AD 59, he wrote the first epistle unto the church of God, which was at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1 and 2.